In my Far Cry 6 versus Far Cry 5 video, a lot of you in the comments were requesting that I do Far Cry 6 versus Far Cry 3 for which game is better next, so here we are. If you're new here and unfamiliar with how this series works, basically what I do is take two games from the same series and compare them in three different categories, being story, gameplay, and open world. Within each category, I have several points I will be scoring the games on. Whichever game I feel does that particular subject better will be awarded a point. The game with the most points by the end will be crowned the winner and the title of the better game. Also keep in mind this video is entirely my opinion, and feel free to leave how you would score the games and which game you think is better in the comments. And without further ado, Far Cry 6 versus Far Cry 3. As we often do in these videos, we are going to start with the story category and talk about the first point, the protagonist. Our protagonist from Far Cry 6 being Danny Rojas, and from Far Cry 3, Jason Brody. Now, if you've watched my other videos on Far Cry 6, you would know I think Danny is a decent protagonist. I think the fact that Danny speaks is a big step up, and they have somewhat of a character arc. Danny at the beginning of Far Cry 6 wants to flee Yara and escape to Miami to live out the American dream before they get dragged into the Yara Resistance Libertad and develop an appetite for killing. They establish some pretty interesting themes with Danny by saying that they are addicted to killing people, that Libertad is just an excuse, a good reason for them to indulge in their killing spree, which is a really interesting theme and ironically enough sounds pretty similar to Jason's. However, unlike Jason's arc, they didn't really follow through with it with Danny. The story had plenty of opportunities to dig deeper into Danny as a character, and I feel they ultimately failed to do so. I wish there was more focus on Danny as a person and what they actually want. Do they want freedom like Danny claims, or is it like what Juan says, that Danny is just addicted to killing and blowing stuff up? Danny didn't have many moments in the story where they opened up and gave us more insight into their past, except with that one scene with Bichu, which was probably Danny's best scene, where Danny explains that they are tired of being seen as a gun or a tool to be used. Danny was still a decent protagonist, but definitely had a lot more potential for a possibly really intriguing and dark character arc, and the story was either just too reluctant or hesitant to pursue that darker theme. Unlike Far Cry 3, which I feel is one of the few games to really dive into the consequences and toll killing has on a person, and while admittedly at first I really didn't like Jason, looking back he was the perfect character for this kind of arc. A rich playboy who's never had to work or earn anything in his life. You can hear the constant panic in Jason during that opening escape sequence at the start of Far Cry 3, and just how terrified he is when he takes his first life. Far Cry 3 really goes deeper into the psychological effects killing does to someone like Jason, and much like what I feel they attempted to do with Danny, Jason eventually grows to love killing so much so that he doesn't even want to leave the island with his friends anymore, which I might add was the whole goal and the reason why he became a killer in the first place. It's great seeing the reaction of all the characters as they recognize how Jason has changed and what he's become. I mean, he's taking out not only pirates but professional mercenaries by the end of the game, and with Citra there to edge him on and drive him further into the darkness, it makes Jason a truly unrecognizable character when you compare him to that scared rich kid from the beginning of the game. Jason Brody by far has the best character arc of the Far Cry series, and in my opinion at least is easily the best protagonist of the series, and Far Cry 3 tells a story you won't see many games tell, or even movies would tell for that matter. And especially in a series like Far Cry where you become a mass murderer without a second thought, Far Cry 3 is really the only game that makes you feel the consequences of those violent actions. It's almost in a way mirroring people who play video games and how we enjoy being a mass murderer in these games, which is a really dark and bold theme to explore, and from Ubisoft nonetheless, the company that often plays it safe with their storytelling when it comes to real world issues. So while Danny isn't a bad protagonist, Jason Brody, or rather his arc and character development, is unmatched in this series, so the first point goes to Far Cry 3. Now for antagonists, I guess you could say Far Cry 3 has two main antagonists, Voss and Hoyt, but for this we're just gonna say it's Voss since he's the one everybody remembers and has one of the most iconic lines in video game history. Voss really steals the show in Far Cry 3. I'd been reading up on how Voss actually came to be in Far Cry 3, and he wasn't even a character when the game was in development. Michael Mando, the man who plays Voss, made such a good impression in his audition that they literally built the entire entire character of Voss based on Michael Mando's performance. They then decide to cut the character of Voss, but then they showcase the definition of insanity scene at E3, and that completely blew up, so that led to them bringing Voss back into the game and giving him a much bigger role than he was ever intended to have. It's really fascinating how this character came to be and how Michael Mando quite literally created Voss on his own, and he was so good that Ubisoft had to change the entire story and base it around Voss. And many fans, including me, believe that Voss deserved an even bigger role in Far Cry 3. For how great he is, he really should have been the antagonist for the entirety of the game, and it's a shame you move on from Voss and onto Hoyt so quickly. Hoyt isn't horrible, but certainly isn't as intriguing as Voss. The motion capture and performance of Voss by Michael Mando, that is likely a lot of improv, is fantastic, and Voss is absolutely the perfect match for a character like Jason Brody. The way I see it, Jason himself had to become insane to kill Voss, which is just so perfectly fitting. Anton Castillo from Far Cry 6 was a disappointing antagonist to me personally, and I found him to be pretty generic, especially when compared to the likes of Voss. Castillo still had a great performance by Giancarlo Esposito, and the guy was still very charismatic and intimidating. That wasn't the issue. The issue was Castillo really didn't have a whole lot to him. His son Diego and their dynamic was probably the most interesting part of Castillo's character, but I didn't really find Castillo's goals or motives particularly good. It's hard to explain, but the whole tyrant who wants to bring wealth to his country but does unspeakable things to do so just feels a little overdone and generic, and I just wanted more from Castillo. Every scene he was in was just him monologuing and displaying his cruelty, and I didn't really feel like I ever got to know or understand this character. I think they were onto something when they talked about his past and when his father was the president in 1967 and how Castillo had to suffer and learn things, but they never went any further than that. So this point will easily go to Voss and Far Cry 3. Plot to me is also pretty easy. Far Cry 6's plot is again focused on the Libertad versus Castillo conflict, resistance or rebellion if you would, versus the big bad tyrant. I feel like I've seen that so many times. I mean, it's literally been done in this series before, in Far Cry 4 with the Golden Path versus Pagan Min. Yet the only difference is there wasn't that personal connection with Danny and Anton like how there was with Ajay and Pagan. Far Cry 3's plot again is I think the best of the series. This story is about Jason and his transformation slash fall to the dark side. I love a good anti-hero, and Jason was certainly one of the best ones I've played, and his descent and transformation to becoming a warrior who enjoys killing and losing himself is not only a unique and fresh plot, but also a very bold one. Far Cry 3 took risks, and they paid off. So once again, point to Far Cry 3. Pacing is another really easy one. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here. Far Cry 3 is much shorter than Far Cry 6. The main story of Far Cry 3 is around 12-ish hours, while Far Cry 6 is around 20 to 25 hours. Now the fact that Far Cry 3's story is shorter doesn't make it better paced. What makes it better paced is the consistency and feeling of progression in the story. Every mission makes you feel one step closer to saving your friends and killing Voss and Hoyt, and the game hardly has any filler or drawn out mission sequences. A lot of people don't like the second island as much in Far Cry 3 and think it may get a little drawn out, which may be true, but I always found it really cool how you get to take this stronger Jason into a new island filled with trained mercenaries who are better trained, have better guns and armor. It's a new challenge and a perfect way to increase the stakes as you push towards the end of the game. Far Cry 6, however, has a lot of filler and drawn out sequences. You're constantly running errands for people. You have to complete a long checklist of missions before you can finally get to the boss or bad guy of that region, and then you can finally go in and kill them. Then you go to the next region, rinse and repeat until you reach Anton. There's several points in the story where it slows down to a crawl and gets so boring. I don't mind a longer story, but when it's inflated by filler and constant pointless tasks and errands, it kills the pacing and flow of the story. So another point for Far Cry 3. The side villains in Far Cry 6 are one of my biggest complaints when it comes to Far Cry 6's story. The side villains are so generic, they hardly have any motives or personality that allows them to stand out from one another. A lot of them feel very cliche and didn't offer much of anything new to the story. They just felt like time-wasting obstacles you need to clear to get to Castillo, and when compared to side villains from most Far Cry games, specifically the Seed family from Far Cry 5, they pale in comparison. And they also pale in comparison to Far Cry 3's side villains. Like I said earlier, Far Cry 3 has several antagonists, Voss and Hoyt. There's also Buck, who takes one of your friends hostage and wants wants you to retrieve a knife for him. The side villains in this game are pretty good. They complement the story well and don't take too much time to kill, unlike Far Cry 6. And while Hoyt may not be as good as Voss, I still would take him over any of the Far Cry 6 side villains. So surprise, surprise, another point for Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 got the clean sweep in the story, as I think many people would expect, but gameplay should definitely be more competitive. Now, Far Cry 3 I feel was one of the last Far Cry games to have major changes to its gunplay. When you compare it to Far Cry 2, and ever since Far Cry 3, each game has just been building and building upon not only its gunplay, but really its gameplay loop as a whole. They found a formula that really works in Far Cry 3, and continue to improve upon it with each new Far Cry game. So while the gameplay still may be pretty similar at its core, there's still some nice changes and improvements in the newer Far Cry games. Far Cry 6 added the new ammo types, although I don't feel like the ammo types really work how they're intended to, since you can just use armor-piercing bullets on everything and you can still one-shot kill any enemy with a headshot. I feel like it was supposed to make the gunplay more strategic and force you to pay attention to which enemy type you're fighting, so use the best bullet type for that particular enemy. The Supremos are also one of my favorite new additions in Far Cry 6. They just shake up the combat a bit. There's quite a few different Supremos and variants you can use that do different things, like constant health regen and self-revive, or shoot a bunch of rockets. It definitely refreshed the combat for me, which I think was much needed, as I was starting to get a little tired of the Far Cry gameplay formula. So I'll give this point to Far Cry 6. Stealth is also quite similar. Far Cry 6 added new tools like the perception grenades that I found extremely helpful. The machete takedown animations are really satisfying, and getting headshots in this game are just so satisfying, especially with that crispy sound effect. Far Cry 3 still has a great stealth system. I love the animations in that game as well, but Far Cry 6 just has some nice general improvements and refinements, along with new tools that make stealth more fun. So point for Far Cry 6. Customization is quite an easy point. Far Cry 6 by far has the best weapon customization in the series. You have way more options for attachments. There's like 3 different suppressors, all kinds of muzzles, a ton of sights, and there's the ammo types and weapon mods that can give you small boosts and advantages to your weapon. Far Cry 6 also of course has the clothing customization that wasn't great in my opinion and could use some work, but it does allow you to customize your character for your specific playstyle and unlock gear that help boost several stats or give you new skills. Far Cry 3 doesn't really have much gun customization. There's the signature weapons, but that's about it. Gun customization wasn't even really a thing until Far Cry 4, so this point is an easy one for Far Cry 6. Trying to decide between these two open worlds is very tough. I love both open worlds. The Rook Islands feel very dangerous and isolated. It really does make Far Cry 3 feel like a survival game, and everything is either kill or be killed. There's wild animals, pirates, and mercenaries stranded on this island with you, and you pretty much need to kill everything with a pulse if you're going to escape. Yara is a beautiful open world as well. I really enjoyed the capital city. We haven't had a dense city like that in Far Cry before, so that was really cool. But for me, Yara doesn't capture that deadly survival-based feel that the Rook Islands do, so I'm personally going to choose the Rook Islands over Yara. Side quests in Far Cry 3, while they do exist, are mostly copy and pasted missions, almost like mini games with no story attached to them. You usually either have to kill a certain target, hunt an animal, stuff like that, and there's not much substance to the side quests. Far Cry 6's side quests do have actual stories attached with them. Even if they aren't the best side stories, they do feel more like proper side quests that aren't just copied and pasted. Both games have outposts, which are great. However, Far Cry 6 does have even more world activities like the anti-air sites and checkpoints that were fun to clear out and give you extra rewards, so this point will go to Far Cry 6. Which finally brings us to the soundtracks. This point is obviously up to your own personal preference, but I largely prefer Far Cry 3's soundtrack. It's definitely one of the more memorable soundtracks of the series for me, and that ending theme where Jason leaves the island is forever ingrained in my memory, so the final point will go to Far Cry 3. This leaves us with a final score of Far Cry 6 4 and Far Cry 3 7, leaving Far Cry 3 as the winner and the better game. I do strongly believe Far Cry 3 is a better game than Far Cry 6, as I'm sure most of you would agree, but again, feel free to let me know in the comments how you would have scored this and which game you think is better and why. I still really enjoyed Far Cry 6, but the story really doesn't come close to Far Cry 3's. If you enjoyed this video though, I've made tons of these which game is better videos, videos for games in the Far Cry series. There's probably well over 10 of them at this point. I have a whole playlist if you want to check that out. I also made videos for Far Cry 6 versus Far Cry 5 and Far Cry 6 versus Far Cry New Dawn that I'll leave links in the description for as well if you want to check those out. Also, consider subscribing for more Far Cry related videos in the future. I may do Far Cry 6 versus Far Cry 4, haven't really decided yet, so let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. And other than that, thanks for watching and have a great day, everybody.